Welcome back, everyone. I hope you managed to get a bite to out of a lunch and get through a few emails. You may have had a chance to visit the virtual booth or two and network with our supporters. Just remember over the next couple of days, these guys are the guys that help bring this conference to life. So if you get a chance, go say good day. Obviously, remember Gallagher sponsors this stream, so you got Ben and Graham over there. So it's a virtual chat. You can go and have a virtual face-to-face. Okay, moving on to our next session. Keeping with the theme of ground cover and nutrient management for livestock from our last presentation, Dr. Meredith Mitchell from Agriculture Victoria, coming from Rutherglen in Victoria, will report on the results from a native pasture trial in ground cover productivity for improved livestock management in the East Gippsland Tambo Valley, which Dr. Mitchell tells me is quite a nice place. Dr. Mitchell is a pasture agronomist, and her research has focused on the selection of native grass cultivars for agricultural systems and the management of existing native pastures. Thanks, Meredith, and over to you.
Thanks, Luke, and thank you for the opportunity to present this afternoon. So my presentation is titled Management of High Country Pastures. I'm reporting on some work that we've done within the Topsoils project, and the Topsoils initiative was an initiative of the East Gippsland CMA and Agriculture Victoria. In collaboration with delivery partners, Agriculture Victoria, East Gippsland Landcare Network, Far East Victoria Landcare, Southern Farming Systems, and Greening Australia. I'm actually coming from Corowa in southern New South Wales today, so I'm on Bangarang country. I'd like to acknowledge the co-authors on this paper, John Cummings, Karen Walker, Fiona Baker, Wayne Burton, Martin Potts, and Carolyn Love. I suppose the first question is, what are high country pastures and why are they important? So this slide here shows what a lot of our typical high country pastures look like. It's steep country that's non-arable, so can't really be sown to any other species. In these parts of the landscape, the main perennial species that we have are the native grasses. And these perennials are important because they provide ground cover. They're important in terms of water use, control of weeds, and also in terms of animal production and livestock feed. The term native grass is this really all-encompassing term that encompasses something like 1,300 different species that are native. And in pastures such as this one shown in the picture here, there's often a range of different perennial native pastures that we have there. And in these systems, it's often sort of these bits of the landscape are considered the back paddock, and management is not always optimum of them, and we can probably get a lot more out of them than we currently do. Native pastures cover a large area in the high rainfall zone. Along the Great Dividing Range of New South Wales into Victoria and into South Australia, there's about 22% of the agricultural land that's covered with native pastures, or approximately 3.1 million hectares. So I thought I'd just start by talking about some of the background to the project and how my involvement came about. So as Luke mentioned, I'm a research agronomist. I've worked in research for close to 30 years now, and I've worked a lot of that time on native grasses. And so in 2016, Marty Potts from Greening Australia gave me a call and said that he was working in East Gippsland in the Tambo Valley, and there was lots of native pastures in that area, and we really needed to get my research out there into the farming community and get adoption of that research. And so then became this partnership between myself as a research officer, extension people within our department, such as John Cummings and also Marty Potts from Greening Australia, and also landholders. And that's where the project developed. And I think it's a continuum, note, these three parts, and we've all got something to learn from each other. And I think a comment was made this morning that we all need to walk together in the journey and share the journey. And I think that's right in terms of the different facets of either research or extension or landholders. We've all got something that we can learn from each other. So the Topsoils project set up two demonstration sites, one at Connors Hill and the other at Reedy Flat, both in the Tambo Valley. And these sites were set up to investigate the effect of nutrient application. And when we're talking in terms of nutrient application, we're talking in terms of applying fertiliser to our native pastures and also strategic grazing of those pastures. And our focus was on production from the pastures, control of weeds, and also ground cover. Ground cover being a high priority as we're talking about sort of steep country that needs cover over the summer to protect the soil surface. These sites were set up in spring 2016 and we're still currently monitoring them. So as I mentioned, we set up 2 demonstration sites, and within each of these sites, we set up 2 areas, a control area, which was managed the way the farmer's current management practice was, and a treatment area, where we imposed rules in terms of grazing management and also fertiliser application. We knew from previous research that had been done that we could have triggers in terms of grazing. So we had a trigger of 1,800 kilograms of dry matter per hectare to put stock on, and a trigger of 1,000 kilograms to remove stock, kilograms of dry matter per hectare to remove stock. We were grazing the sites with cattle, and part of what we really wanted to look at was if we had summer rainfall events and we got growth from these pastures, could we utilise that growth using these triggers? We also looked at fertiliser applications, and on our treatment areas, we applied fertiliser in the form of single superphosphate. And the reason we use single super was that it's a fertiliser that's widely recognised and understood by the farming community. Previous research has shown that native pastures, a target soil fertility of 12, an OLSM-P of 12 milligrams per kilogram could be maintained on them. It wasn't at a level where there was change in composition of the pastures. That was a level where we could successfully maintain it and weren't mining the system. If we were removing product, we were returning product to the soils. So at each of our sites, in those 2 areas, we set up 3 permanent quadrats. So the permanent quadrats are like this one that you can see in the top right-hand corner of the slide. So these permanent quadrats were a metre square with 100 grid points in them. And we monitored those permanent quadrats, and all our measurements we did twice a year. We looked at them in spring and also in summer. We looked at ground cover as being an important measure, and that was particularly important at the end of summer. And we measured ground cover as a visual estimate at those permanent quadrats. We looked at perennial grass persistence because we're really interested in what the perennial grasses were doing. And so at those quadrats, you can see in the bottom image there, me down on my hands and knees counting the bases of the perennial grasses within that quadrat. We looked at pasture composition, and this was done by throwing a pasture stick 50 times in the control area and also in the treatment area, and recording what species occurred where that landed. We looked at soil fertility by collecting soil samples and sending them away for analysis. And we also looked at pasture quality, again, sending samples away for analysis. So this is just to give you an idea of where the Tambo Valley is in East Gippsland. So I'm based up here in northeast Victoria at Rutherglen, and the sites, the more southern site is at Reedy Flat, and then I've got the Connors Hill site a bit further north. And so they're on gunai lands. And for me to get to the field sites is about a 3.5-hour drive. And that's over Mount Hotham, so always a very picturesque journey. So we selected 2 different sites, and the reason we selected 2 different sites is that different composition of species occurs in relation to aspect. And so our site at Reedy Flat had a more southerly aspect and was dominated by the native grass Microlenus dapoides, or weeping grass. This is a native grass that is a rhizomatous grass. It spreads with both rhizomes and stolons. It's very tolerant of acid soils. It's also very tolerant of close grazing and drought. But it is a species that, even though it's a cool season growing species, it responds very well to summer rainfall and puts growth on any time that we get rainfall events. It has a very wide distribution from Queensland right through to Adelaide, into Tasmania, and also southwest Western Australia. Typically occurs in areas above 500 millimetre rainfall. So this is our ready flat site. So the pictures on the right side of those is the treatment area, and our treatment area at the ready flat site was 1.3 hectares. The top slide is the top image is December 17 and the bottom image is April 18. So this site started with what we would consider a moderate soil fertility. It had an Olsen P of 9.1, but it was quite an acid, well, an acid site with a pH of 4.8 in calcium chloride. The second site was dominated by the native species redgrass, or red leg grass, some people call it, Bothria climacra. Again, this is a grass that is quite a prostrate growing native grass. It's a warm season or a C4 growing grass, so most of its production is in the warmer months of the year. And it typically occurs on our northern slopes, the hotter, drier parts of the landscape. It has wide distribution in southeastern Australia and is also a species that's known to be tolerant of acid soils and also tolerant of close grazing. So this is our Connors Hill site that was dominated by the red grass. Again, you can see the treatment area on the right of the images on the right-hand side of the screen in December 17 and then in April 18. So this site was a bit more diverse in terms of its species than the Reedy Flat site. It had 23 different species when we first did composition at the site. It had a soil Olsen P of 4.5, so what we consider quite a low fertility site. And it also had acid soils with a pH of 4.8. I thought I'd just give you some details about what the weather conditions were like from the beginning of the trial. So you see the dates across the bottom of this graph with the blue bars, the rainfall that we've received, and the purple line, the long-term average rainfall. So as I mentioned, I went into this trial with the thought that we would set it up to look at response of these native grasses to summer rainfall events. And one of the first things that occurred going into the trial was we had below average rainfall and went into drought. So that makes it tricky establishing a trial with certain criteria you're looking at, and then those seasonal conditions don't occur. And then I think this morning we heard from Penny Gray about being at Ensay, which is very close to where these field sites were. Then we had the bushfires at the beginning of 2020. And I suppose one of the comments I'd just like to make here is that seasonal conditions don't only affect how pastures grow and our environmental conditions. Seasonal conditions also affect our farming communities and how interested they are in receiving new information and learning from people like me, like a researcher. It's fairly understandable that if landholders are out there feeding their animals because of drought conditions, it's very difficult for them to come to field days. And the same is after bushfires, when they're, again feeding out because they've lost pasture or putting up fences, that they're not coming along to field days. So I think that's one of the things that we need to always consider, that seasonal conditions don't only affect pasture, but also affect the social climate that we're working in. So now to present some of the results that we collected from these sites. So this is composition at the Reedy Flat site and the composition at the end of summer. And so I've divided the composition into those 4 classes: native, non-native, broadleaf and bare ground. And I suppose one of the things I'd like to highlight here is that we've always had high composition of native pasture on the site. We did have a decline in 2019, and that was a result of the dry conditions. And when we had that decline in the native, we had that increase in bare ground. The other hot point I'd like to make here is this increase in the broadleaf in 2020. That was just as a result of some seasonal conditions with summer rainfall that allowed a lot more broadleaf species to germinate. And our spring composition data has shown that we have had an increase in the subclover content, and subclover is important in terms of our in terms of the forage quality of our pastures, and is important in terms of animal production. In terms of ground cover, which was one of the key things that we wanted to measure and wanted to look at the Reedy Flat site, we've particularly in the treatment area, we've maintained high ground cover throughout the period of the trial. The same hasn't been as true at the Connors Hill site. We've had lower ground covers there in the treatment area. And I think one of the messages that I take home from this is that aspect has a big impact on ground cover. And the northerly aspects, we need to be a lot more careful in terms of maintaining our ground cover and how we treat these environments to maintain that ground cover. In terms of perennial grass persistence, this is data from our Reedy Flat site looking at the native grass microlina. We've got the treatment area and the control area. And the way we measured perennial grass persistence was with the quadrat and looking at the number of perennial bases of plants in each of those 100 squares in our quadrats. So even though these numbers seem very low as percentages, we consider a native pasture or any pasture if it has a basal cover of below 5% as a good perennial basis. So I think the main message from this slide is that the treatment area and the control area have reasonable cover of native grasses, of the microlina, of the perennial, but we can see that the seasonal conditions did have an impact on them. So in terms of soil fertility, which is one of the things that we were looking at about applying fertiliser to the soils to get increased productivity. So this is data from the Reedy Flat site, and at the start of the experiment, it had Olsen peas around that 9 or 10, depending on the treatment or the control area. There was a slight difference between those two areas. And in 2017, we applied 232 kilograms of single superphosphate to that area. And we apply in 2018, we also applied 200 kilograms per hectare of super. So that's why we've got this peak here. And I suppose the thing I want to highlight here is that the control area is showing that trend of declining soil fertility. And I think if we've got production systems where we're removing product, so in this case, we're removing cattle from the system in terms of cattle are grazing it and then being sold off the farm, we need to be applying fertiliser or some sort of nutrients need to be returned to the system so that we're not mining the system. We need to remember that we're not in the act of mining, we're actually in the system of farming and making the most of what we can out of these areas. One thing I'll say here is that our Connors Hill site, I think we realised we were doing the right thing or on the right track when the farmer applied fertiliser to the control area. So that confounded our results a bit when we were hoping that the treatment area was different to the control area and the farmer applied fertiliser there. As I mentioned, as I mentioned, we looked at feed quality, and we looked at a range of characteristics in terms of feed quality, in terms of crude protein, digestibility, and metabolizable energy. And here I'm just presenting the crude protein data for the Connors Hill site. So this was the pasture that was dominated by the red grass. And maintenance in terms of crude protein for livestock is about 5%. So we're always above that. And you can see that there's a range of different crude proteins to do with seasonal conditions. And I think the forage quality data is valuable because if you look in the literature, there is very little feed quality data available for many of our native pastures. And we need this so that farmers and landholders can accurately feed budget in terms of quantity and also as well as quality of the feed that they have on offer. So landholder engagement throughout the project was pretty important. So here am I in a paddock talking to a group of farmers about identifying native grasses. And as I said before, it's important that we walked alongside landholders within this project. Landholders have a lot of knowledge about what species they have on their land and also about how different species perform in their environment. And so we all need to be able to learn from each other. And so throughout the project, we've had a range of field days, seminars at a range of different locations within the project area. But this has been challenging with drought, bushfire, and also COVID. So in conclusion, I think one of the things that we all need to do is learn to recognise native grasses. There's a huge range of native grasses out there, and I think that they're really a valuable resource, but really in many cases undervalued. In terms of managing our native pastures, I think we've got some key triggers or key recommendations, but there's not one recipe. Everyone's recipe is different. The ingredients might be the same, but the way they've mixed together and what the outcome is different. So we have target soil fertilities of an Olsen P of 12 milligrams per kilogram. And I think if we can lift our soil fertility, that lifts both the nutrient content of our pastures and gives us better livestock outcomes. We need to have minimum herbage mass and ground covers in place, and they're really important in terms of maintaining our soil cover. One of the things at the start of this project, I mentioned that we had a trigger for grazing of 800 kilograms per hectare of dry matter. Since undertaking this project, we've lowered that trigger to 1,500 kilograms because there are a lot of times when the pasture wasn't getting to those heights and so the pasture wasn't being grazed. So we've, I think, come back to a more realistic approach to what the trigger is for putting grazing on. We're still maintained that minimum herbage mass and when the animals are removed from the pasture. Within our native pastures, we need to avoid long periods of rest because that results in a lot of dead standing material. And dead standing material isn't quality food. In late summer, we need to maintain plant litter because that's important for maintaining ground cover. And I think that we all need to walk alongside each other. Everyone's got something to share and all of us have got valuable knowledge that we can add to each other. Thank you.
Thanks, Meredith. Great to see the incredible collaborative effort you guys have all put together to actually get to this point. Look, we've only got time. We've got 3 minutes before we have to move on to the next session. So we've got time. You actually have generated a lot of questions here.
Oh, that's good. That's good that it shows there's actually someone online. It's really hard not having any idea whether you're just sitting here talking to yourself.
Well, it's something I didn't mention earlier. I don't want to go on too much about it, but we've got roughly 3,000 people tuning in from across the country at the moment. So we have a fair few in this particular stream, but I'll get straight onto the question. So we've got Sarah Fia has asked a question here. Native pastures composition expectation. Perennial grasses, herbs, forbs. How was this considered and managed when weed control was being undertaken and who was sacrificed?
Well, I suppose our focus was the agricultural production. So it was looking at the species that had the most value to the animal. And I suppose I should just mention these systems we're talking about are native pastures, not native grasslands. So they're highly modified systems anyway. And so there are some herbs in them, but a lot of them are just dominated by native grasses. So I think that there definitely is a trade-off between what species we looked at. And I think that comes back to my point at the end. There's sort of recipes or suggestions of triggers we can give, but what actually the recipe is or what the outcome is different for everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Meredith. I would have thought there was a very localized sort of solution for every situation, right?
Mm.
Guys, we've only got 1 more minute left, so I just wanted to sort of remind everybody, keep posting questions for this short little next 4 minutes. We're about to go to a break for about 4 minutes when we get the next speaker in, but keep posting those questions because we're actually archiving those questions and we can give those to Meredith after the conference and she can endeavour to get back to those questions and answer those. So again, thanks again for the presentation, Meredith. It was very, very insightful. And we'll go now to a 4-minute break, and I'll see everyone back then. Thank you.